That's a final warning, Mr. Miller. The tow truck is already paid for. Either you move that rusting piece of junk into a garage that complies with Whispering Pines Estate's aesthetic standards, or I authorize its removal and disposal as abandoned refuse. Your choice. The voice, a syrupy blend of condescension and manufactured authority, belonged to a woman who looked like she'd been poured into a beige pantsuit and had set in a way that was both unfortunate and vaguely threatening. Her name was Karen, and the laminated badge pinned to her ample chest declared her HOA president. She stood on the edge of my property, a clipboard held like a scepter, her back to the pristine, cookie-cutter houses of her domain, and her eyes fixed on my grandfather's 1968 Ford ERF 250, which was parked exactly where it had been parked for the better part of 30 years, gleaming under a fresh coat of wax next to my barn. Rusting piece of junk? The truck was in better condition than her attitude. I felt a slow, cold burn start in my gut, the kind of anger I hadn't felt since my last tour. I'd spent 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, building things under pressure, solving problems that involved more than just petty tyrants with clipboards, and I'd learned to control that fire. But today it was simmering dangerously close to the surface. I looked from her smug face to the tow truck driver, leaning against his rig, parked just off the shoulder of the county road, a vulture waiting for the signal. The financial loss would be one thing, but the sheer, unadulterated gall of this woman, whereas standing on land that had been in my family since before this state was even a state, telling me what I could and could not do, was a declaration of war. She took a step forward, planting one sensible shoed foot onto the clover of my hayfield, and that was the moment the battle line was officially drawn. Before we get into exactly how a 130-year-old piece of paper brought this woman's entire plastic kingdom crashing down, do me a favor. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button. I'm told that's how this works. And drop a comment below telling me where you're from. Or better yet, share your own HOA nightmare. It seems like everyone has one. And believe me when I tell you, hearing from you all helps remind me that we're not alone in fighting these little fiefdoms. Now back to the moment it all began, and with this self-appointed queen trying to annex my life into her rule book. I had inherited this land, 160 acres of rolling hills and oak groves, from my grandmother. It was the original homestead, granted to my great-great-grandfather, Jedediah Miller, in 1892 for his service in a conflict most people only read about in history books. The original farmhouse, which I had been painstakingly restoring for the past 2 years since my retirement from the military, stood on a rise overlooking a creek. The barn, weathered but solid as a fortress, housed my tools, my tractor, and the aforementioned Ford truck, which my grandfather had bought new, and which I considered less a vehicle and more a member of the family. For 2 years I'd lived in peace. My only neighbors were the deer, the wild turkeys, and the occasional coyote. Then, Whispering Pines Estates happened. A developer bought the adjacent 1,000 acres of farmland, and almost overnight, a forest of McMansions sprouted like invasive fungi. I didn't mind, not really. Live and let live. My property line was clearly marked by an old stone wall my ancestors had built, a physical and legal boundary that had been respected for over a century. Or so I thought. Karen's claim was that a recent survey review had revealed a clerical overlap, and that my 10 acres closest to the development, the very 10 acres my house and barn sat on, had been provisionally absorbed into the HOA's jurisdiction, pending a formal boundary adjustment. It was the most ridiculous, legally unsound thing I had ever heard. Provisionally absorbed, I repeated, tasting the absurdity of the words. That's not a thing, Karen. Why, that's not how property law works. She smiled a tight, triumphant little smile. It is when the County Planning Commission signs off on the preliminary plat, Mr. Miller. It's all in the covenants you should have received. Page 47, Section 8, Subsection B, Vehicle Condition and Storage. She tapped her clipboard. I have it right here. All vehicles must be in operable condition, free of visible rust, and stored in an approved structure. Your truck fails on all counts in the eyes of the Architectural Review Committee. I looked at the truck. The engine turned over on the first try, every time. The visible rust was a small patch of surface patina on the original bumper I was planning to re-chrome. One in the approved structure was a barn that had stood for a century before her architectural review committee was even a glimmer in a developer's greedy eye. The logic was so twisted, so purposefully obtuse, it was an insult to intelligence itself. This land, I said, my voice dangerously calm, is not and never will be part of your HOA. You have no authority here. The stone wall is the boundary. It has been for 130 years. She waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that I'm sure worked wonders in her little meetings. Walls can be moved, Mr. Miller. Paperwork is forever. We have the paperwork. Now, for the last time, are you going to move the truck, or am I? She pulled a small radio from her belt. This was it. This was the moment of escalation. I could play her game, get into a shouting match, would maybe even get myself arrested, which I was sure was her ultimate goal. Or I could do what the Army taught me to do best, observe, assess, and plan a counteroffensive. I took a breath, letting the fresh country air clear my head. You know what, Karen? I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. You're right. You have the paperwork. You have the authority. Go ahead, make the call. The look of triumphant shock on her face was almost worth the trouble that I knew was coming. She fumbled with the radio, her eyes wide, not quite believing her victory was so easy. Tow it, she squawked into the radio. Authorization KPHOA1. Remove the derelict vehicle. The driver gave a lazy thumbs up and started backing his rig toward my driveway. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, and watched. I watched him hook up my grandfather's truck. And I watched Karen puff up with pride, making a little note on her clipboard. And as the tow truck pulled away, dragging a piece of my family's history behind it, I made a note of my own. Not on a clipboard, but in the part of my mind reserved for promises. And the promise I made to myself was simple. I was going to dismantle Karen's little kingdom, piece by bureaucratic piece. The first volley after the tow truck incident arrived via certified mail 3 days later. It was a thick envelope bearing the grandiose Whispering Pines Estates logo, a stylized pine tree that looked more like a green spear. Inside was a bill for $2,500, $1,000 for the vehicle abatement and disposal fee, a $500 fine for non-compliance with vehicle storage covenants, a $500 fine for landscaping inconsistencies, my hayfield apparently, and another $500 for an initial infraction processing fee. It was extortion, pure and simple, but dressed up in the language of rules and regulations. Stapled to the bill was a letter, personally signed by Karen, informing me that a lien had been placed on my property for the amount owed. A lien on a property that had been free and clear in my family for generations. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. This wasn't just about a truck anymore. It was about my home, my land, my heritage. I spread the papers out on my grandfather's old oak dining table. Ate the same table where my ancestors had probably planned their harvests and weathered their storms. The irony was not lost on me. I was facing a different kind of storm, a tempest of paperwork and petty tyranny. My first instinct was to drive over to her house, her address was proudly listed on the HOA letterhead, and have a conversation that would be decidedly less calm than our first encounter. But I knew that was what she wanted. She was baiting me, trying to provoke a reaction that would paint me as the unhinged aggressor. An angry veteran with a grudge. It was a tired trope, and I wasn't about to play the part. Instead, I did what I do best. I started a file. I labeled it Operation Whispering Pines. A little bit of gallows humor to keep my spirits up. The first documents to go into the file were the bill and the lien notification. Then I sat down at my computer and began my reconnaissance. I started with the Whispering Pines Estates HOA website. It was a glossy corporate affair, full of pictures of happy, homogeneous families grilling on identical patios. The governing documents section was a labyrinth of PDFs, covenants, conditions and restrictions, CC and Rs, bylaws, architectural guidelines. I downloaded every single one. It was over 300 pages of dense legalese, a carefully constructed fortress of regulations designed to control every aspect of a homeowner's life, from the color of their front door to the breed of their dog. I spent the next 2 days reading, highlighting, and making notes. It was drier than a ration cracker in the desert, but I forced myself to understand it, to learn the language of my enemy. I needed to know the rules of her game before I could start breaking them. Then I moved on to the county. I accessed the online records for the Planning Commission, searching for the preliminary plat Karen had mentioned. I found it easily enough. It showed the entire 1,000-acre development, with every lot and street laid out. And there on the edge of the plat was my property. A thick, clear line demarcated the boundary between Whispering Pines and the Miller homestead. There was no overlap, no provisional absorption. There was a note, however, from the surveyor mentioning that the adjacent property, parcel 7B, mine, was a historic homestead and that its boundaries were established and inviolable. Karen hadn't just bent the truth, she had snapped it in half and thrown it away. She had lied, blatantly, provably lied. This was a critical piece of intelligence. It moved her actions from a simple, albeit aggressive, misunderstanding to deliberate malicious fraud. I printed the plat map, the surveyor's notes, and a satellite image from the county's GIS system, which clearly showed the old stone wall as the property line. These went into the file. The next phase of my operation was human intelligence. I needed to know who I was dealing with, not just the HOA president, but the woman herself. A quick search of public records and social media painted a clearer picture of Karen Peterson. 58 years old, twice divorced, no children. She had moved to the area 3 years ago after selling a consulting business in another state. Before becoming the full-time, apparently unpaid president of the HOA, she had no discernible career in property management or law. She was a professional busybody who had found her calling in the petty tyrannies of suburban life. I also found the minutes from the last 2 years of HOA meetings, posted on their website as required by their own bylaws. Reading through them was a journey into a world of mind-numbing minutia and breathtaking arrogance. Fines were levied for unapproved garden gnomes, for holiday decorations left up 3 days past the January 15th deadline, for basketball hoops that were not the officially sanctioned shade of black. Karen's name was on every page, her voice dominating every discussion, her rulings final and absolute. But then I noticed a pattern. The fines were increasing in both frequency and amount, and there were several mentions of special assessments for community enhancement projects that were suspiciously vague. The most recent was a $50,000 assessment for a security system upgrade, even though the front gate was the only entrance and it was already automated. Something wasn't right. The money. Where was it all going? My file was getting thicker. I had the fraudulent claim, the official map, the bylaws, the meeting minutes. It was a good start, but it was all just paper. To win this fight, I needed more. I needed allies. And I had a feeling I knew where to find them, behind the perfectly painted front doors of Whispering Pines Estates, living in quiet desperation under Karen's rule. It was time to go behind enemy lines. But first, I had to deal with the immediate threat. The lien was a cloud on my title. Inner and the disposed-of truck was a wound in my heart. I called the tow company listed on the bill. A gruff voice answered. I gave him the reference number. "Yeah, the old Ford? From the Miller place?" he said. "Yeah, it's here. Lady said to hold it for 30 days for payment, then scrap it." A cold relief washed over me. It wasn't destroyed, not yet. "Don't you dare touch it," I said, my voice low and steady. "That truck was stolen. The woman who authorized the tow had no legal authority to do so. You are now in possession of stolen property. If so much as a single scratch is added to that vehicle, I will hold your company personally and criminally liable." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Look, buddy," the driver said, his tone shifting from gruff to wary. "The lady had paperwork. She's the HOA president." "She's a liar," I said, "and her paperwork is fraudulent. I have the official county plat map and my deed right here. That property is not in her jurisdiction. You've been duped into committing grand theft auto. Now I'm going to come down there and retrieve my property. I suggest you have it ready for me. Or my next call will be to the sheriff." Another pause, longer this time. All right, he grumbled. "Just no trouble, okay? I'm just a working guy." "The trouble isn't with you," I said, and I meant it. "It's with her." I hung up the phone. Phase 1 of the counterattack was complete. I was getting my truck back. But the war was just beginning. Getting the truck back was an ordeal in itself, a microcosm of the bureaucratic nightmare Karen had created. The tow yard was a muddy, forlorn place on the industrial outskirts of town. The owner, a man whose stained coveralls and weary eyes told a story of long hours and little joy, was waiting for me. He had the work order from Karen in his hand, a flimsy piece of paper that he clutched like a shield. I had my file. I laid the county plat map on the hood of his pickup truck, the crisp lines and official seals, a stark contrast to the grease-stained metal. I pointed to the boundary line. I pointed to the surveyor's note. Then I showed him my deed, the original patent from 1892, and the subsequent deeds passed down through my family. As you can see, I said, keeping my voice level and professional, her authority ends at this line. And now she has no more legal right to tow a vehicle from my property than you have to tow one from the mayor's garage. He stared at the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He might have been just a working guy, but he wasn't stupid. He could recognize an official document when he saw one. He looked from my paperwork to Karen's flimsy work order. She said it was all legal. She even paid in advance with the HOA credit card, he mumbled, as if that sanctified the whole transaction. That little detail, the HOA credit card, was a golden nugget of information. I filed it away for later. She lied, as her consumer. I said simply, and in doing so, she implicated you in a crime. Now, I'm not interested in making your life difficult. I just want my truck back. No storage fees, no hookup charges. You were an unwitting accomplice to theft. Tutorn, and that's the price of your education. He chewed on his lip for a moment, then gave a long, defeated sigh. All right, he said, handing me back my papers. Get your truck. Just get it out of here. I don't want any part of this. He led me to the back of the yard where my grandfather's Ford sat, looking forlorn and out of place amongst a collection of wrecked sedans and rusted minivans. Seeing it there, a chain still loosely draped over the axle, sent another surge of cold anger through me. It was like seeing a family member held hostage. I checked it over carefully. No new scratches, no damage. They had been careful, at least. I signed a release form, making sure to cross out any clauses that admitted fault or liability. And a few minutes later, I was driving my truck out of that muddy yard. The familiar rumble of the 390 V8 engine, a comforting sound. The first battle was a victory, albeit a small one. But Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. I knew her reprisal would be swift and petty. It came 2 days later in the form of a certified letter from a law firm I'd never heard of, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. The letterhead was impressive, the paper thick and creamy. The contents were less so. It was a cease and desist order, drafted in the most aggressive and threatening language imaginable. It accused me of harassment and intimidation of an HOA official, the tow truck driver, apparently, tortious interference with a legitimate HOA contract, and willful disregard for community covenants. It demanded that I immediately cease all communication with HOA vendors and officials, and that I remit payment for the $2,500 fine, plus an additional $1,000 in legal consultation fees within 10 business days, or face immediate legal action, including but not limited to foreclosure proceedings. It was a classic bully tactic, a legal broadside meant to intimidate, overwhelm, and bankrupt the target into submission. They were trying to drown me in paper, to make the fight so expensive and exhausting that I would just give up and pay. They clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. I had spent years navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Department of Defense. This was amateur hour. I put the letter in my file, right next to the fraudulent lien. Then I picked up the phone and called the one person I knew could help me navigate this particular minefield. "Us, Jake," I said, when he answered. "It's John Miller." "John, you old dog, how the hell are you?" Colonel Jake the Shark. Riley had been my commanding officer in the Corps of Engineers, and later a trusted friend. After retiring, he'd gone to law school on the GI Bill, and now ran a small but fearsome practice in the state capitol, specializing in veterans affairs, and, as he put it, kicking bullies in the teeth. "I'm good, Jake. But I've run into a bit of a local warlord and I could use a legal airstrike. I spent the next 30 minutes laying out the whole situation, from Karen's first appearance to the cease and desist letter. I could hear Jake chuckling on the other end of the line. "Oh, this is beautiful, John," he said when I was done. And it's a classic case of what I call small pond dictator syndrome. They get a little taste of power, and it goes right to their head. Slander of title, fraudulent liens, attempted extortion. This Karen character isn't just an amateur. She's a walking torts textbook. "So, what's my move?" I asked. "Patience," Jake said. "Don't respond to the letter. Don't talk to them. Don't give them anything. They've made the first move, and it's a weak one. They're bluffing. A foreclosure proceeding on a property that isn't even in their jurisdiction? A judge would laugh them out of court and probably sanction their lawyer for filing a frivolous lawsuit. Let them spend their money. In the meantime, you keep gathering intelligence. You said you thought the finances were fishy?" "Something's not right," I said. "Share vague special assessments. Rumors of projects that never materialize. She paid for the tow with an HOA credit card." "Bingo," Jake said. "That's your weak point. That's the seam in their armor. An HOA is a nonprofit corporation. Their financials are, by law, supposed to be open to their members. If you can get your hands on their books, I'll bet you a bottle of single malt that you'll find more than just creative accounting. You'll find Karen's personal slush fund." "How do I get the books?" I asked. "I'm not a member." "You find a member who's as pissed off as you are," Jake said. "There's always one. Probably more than one. You said it yourself. You need allies. Go find them. Turn your one-man reconnaissance mission into a full-blown insurgency." The call with Jake solidified my strategy. The legal battle would be his domain, and my battlefield would be Whispering Pines itself. My mission: to find the cracks in Karen's regime, to find the other people she had bullied, and to turn them into a resistance movement. My first target was a house 2 doors down from the main gate. Every time I drove past, I noticed a small, hand-painted sign tucked into a flower bed near the front door. It read, "The Davidsons. We believe in science, kindness, and that love is love." It was a small act of defiance in a neighborhood where every other lawn was an unadorned green carpet. I figured the people who lived there might be receptive to a little rebellion. I parked my truck on the county road, well outside the jurisdiction of the gate camera, and walked up to their door. I was in civilian clothes, but my posture and haircut probably still screamed military. I rang the bell. A man about my age with kind eyes and a weary slump to his shoulders opened the door. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I hope so," I said, extending a hand. "My name is John Miller. I'm your neighbor, the one with the old farm. I think we have a common enemy." Mr. Davidson, Tom he told me to call him, led me into his kitchen. The house was immaculate, stylish, and had the faint, sterile smell of a place where people are afraid to live too loudly. His wife, Sarah, joined us, her face etched with the same weary caution as her husband's. I sat at their granite island, a stranger in a strange land, and laid out my story. I told them about the truck, the fraudulent lien, the cease and desist letter. I showed them the plat map and the surveyor's notes. As I spoke, I saw a flicker of something in their eyes. Recognition. And they had been living this reality, just in a different form. When I finished, Sarah let out a long, slow breath she seemed to have been holding for years. "The play set," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What?" I asked. "Our son, Leo," Tom explained, his jaw tight. "He's 7. Last year, for his birthday, we bought him a play set, a nice wooden one. We put it in the backyard. 2 days later, we got a letter from Karen, a fine for $500 for an unapproved structure. Apparently, the stain color wasn't on the pre-approved list of earth tones. It was Sierra Redwood instead of Canyon Brown. We had to take it down," Sarah continued, her eyes welling up. "Leo was heartbroken. We applied for approval for a new one, in the right color. The committee, which is just Karen and 2 of her cronies, denied the application. One said playsets detract from the serene, adult-oriented atmosphere of the community. So, a 7-year-old boy can't have a swing set because it offends Karen's sense of serenity?" I asked, my own anger rising on their behalf. "That's the beginning of it," Tom said. pulling a thick folder from a kitchen drawer. It was just like my own file. He opened it and the contents spilled out. Violation notices, angry emails, threatening letters, a fine for their satellite dish, which was the only way to get decent internet in the area. A fine because their lawn service had cut the grass a quarter of an inch shorter than the mandated 2 inches. A fine because a package was left on their porch for more than 3 hours. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. A relentless campaign of harassment designed to grind them down. Wow, now we tried to fight it at first, Sarah said. We went to a board meeting. Karen made a public spectacle of us, read our violations out loud, talked about how people who can't follow simple rules bring down property values. She turned the other neighbors against us. People we thought were our friends stopped talking to us. It was humiliating. They had given up. They paid the fines, took down the playset, and tried to become invisible. Their story was exactly what I needed, but hearing it filled me with a cold fury. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power. It was about one woman's need to control and humiliate everyone around her. She's isolated you, I said. She's made you feel like you're the only ones. You're not. I told him about my conversation with Jake, about the plan to go after the HOA's finances. By law, even as a homeowner, you have the right to inspect the HOA's financial record, I explained. All of them. The checks, the bank statements, the credit card bills. She can't legally deny you. Tom looked skeptical. We asked once. She said the records were with the accountant for auditing and would be available in 6 months. She's stalling, I said. It's another lie. We need to send a formal written request via certified mail, citing the specific state statute that grants you access. If she refuses after that, she's breaking the law and we'll have her. A spark of hope, the first I'd seen, appeared in Tom's eyes. You really think this will work? I think it's a start, I said. It's a loose thread. If we pull on it hard enough, her whole sweater might unravel. The Davidsons agreed. Tom, who was a data analyst for a living, was practically giddy at the prospect of getting his hands on spreadsheets and financial statements. We drafted the letter right there at their kitchen island, a formal, polite, but legally ironclad demand for access to the books. The next day, Tom sent it via certified mail. The resistance had its first official members. My next stop was a few streets over. I was looking for the house of a retired couple, the Hendersons. Their name had appeared in the HOA meeting minutes multiple times in relation to fines for landscape maintenance. I found them in their front yard, a man and a woman in their late 70s, staring mournfully at a magnificent but clearly dying oak tree. I introduced myself, and it didn't take long for their story to come tumbling out. The oak tree was a heritage tree, designated as such by the original developer. When the HOA covenants stipulated that these trees could not be removed or significantly altered without a certified arborist's report and committee approval. The problem was, their tree had contracted a fungal blight. They had hired an arborist who recommended immediate treatment and the removal of several large dead branches that posed a safety risk. They submitted the arborist's report and the request to the committee. Karen denied it. Her reasoning? The treatment was experimental, and the removal of the branches would negatively impact the aesthetic canopy of the street. She fined them $1,000 for failure to maintain a heritage tree in a healthy state, and another $1,000 when they had the dead branches removed anyway, citing safety concerns. Now they were facing foreclosure over a mountain of fines and legal fees, all because they tried to save a dying tree. She's trying to take our house, Mrs. Henderson said, tears streaming down her face. The house we were supposed to retire in, all because of a tree. It's not about the tree, I said, my voice gentle. It's never about the tree. It's about control. I told them about the Davidsons, about our plan. I told them they weren't alone. That evening, we held our first insurgency meeting. It was small, just me, the Davidsons, and the Hendersons, gathered around my old oak dining table. It felt clandestine, revolutionary. We were a motley crew. A retired soldier, a data analyst, a graphic designer, and 2 grandparents. But we were united by a common enemy and a shared sense of injustice. Tom reported that Karen had received his certified letter. The 10-day window for her to respond had begun. And the Hendersons, with newfound courage, agreed to let me forward their story and documentation to my lawyer, Jake. Sarah, the graphic designer, had an idea. "We can't be the only ones," she said. "There have to be others. But they're all too scared to talk. We need a way to reach them, a way to show them they're not alone." She proposed creating an anonymous website, a secure forum where residents of Whispering Pines could share their stories without fear of retaliation. We could post the evidence we had: my plat map, the stories of the place set and the oak tree, the vague financial reports from the HOA website. We would call it Whispering Pines Unfiltered. It was brilliant. It would bypass Karen's control of information and allow us to build our army in the shadows. For the next week we worked. And Tom secured a private server and coded a simple but secure website. Sarah designed a clean, professional-looking interface. I wrote the initial content, carefully laying out the facts, scrubbing any emotional language, and presenting the evidence in a clear, undeniable way. We included a link to the relevant state laws regarding HOA transparency and homeowner rights. Then we launched it, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Sarah designed a simple postcard-sized flyer. On one side, it had a picture of a garden gnome with a red circle and slash through it. On the other, it just said, "Tired of the rules? You are not alone," followed by the website address. We didn't put them in mailboxes. That was a federal offense, and Karen would have loved to use it against us. Instead, late one night, Tom and I drove through the neighborhood, and I used my soldiering skills to quietly and discreetly slip a flyer under the windshield wiper of every single car parked in a driveway. It was a small act, but it felt like a major offensive. We had lit the fuse. Now we just had to wait and see if the community would catch fire. The response was not a fire, it was a flood. Within 48 hours of our late-night flyer drop, the Whispering Pines Unfiltered website was inundated with posts. The stories poured in, a torrent of frustration, anger, and despair that had been bottled up for years. There was the single mom who was fined because her trash can was left at the curb for 2 hours past the 6 p.m. deadline. She was a nurse and had been held up at the hospital during a difficult shift. And there was the young couple on their honeymoon who came home to a $500 fine because their lawn service had missed a week and the grass had grown half an inch too tall. There was the man who was ordered to remove the small "Support Our Troops" ribbon magnet from his car because it was an unapproved adornment. Each story was a small injustice on its own, but together they painted a devastating picture of a community living under the thumb of a petty dictator. Karen's name was in every post, a recurring villain in dozens of domestic dramas. The forum became a place of shared catharsis. People who had been isolated and shamed realized they were not alone. They were victims of a systemic pattern of abuse. Sarah's design and Tom's secure platform worked perfectly. People posted anonymously, but they verified their residency with Tom via a secure email system, ensuring that Karen or her cronies couldn't infiltrate the site with false information. My role was to be the moderator and strategist. I read every post, cataloging the complaints and looking for patterns. The financial angle was becoming clearer. So many of the fines seemed arbitrary, designed not to enforce a rule, but to generate revenue. Where was all that money going? The answer came on the 10th day after Tom had sent his certified letter. A thick envelope arrived at his house. Not from Karen, but from the HOA's law firm, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. It was a masterpiece of legal obfuscation. The letter stated that, while the HOA was committed to transparency, the sheer volume of the financial records requested made immediate compliance unduly burdensome. It claimed that compiling the records would require significant man-hours from their accounting firm, and that, per the bylaws, the cost of this compilation would have to be borne by the requesting homeowner. The estimated cost, they wrote, was a staggering $7,500, payable in advance. It was a checkmate, or so they thought. A brilliant, cynical move to use the rules to make the rules inaccessible. Tom was deflated. "We can't afford that," he said during our nightly strategy session at my farmhouse. "They've beaten us." "No, they haven't," I said, a slow grin spreading across my face. "They've just made the single biggest mistake they could have made." I pulled out the copy of the HOA bylaws that I had downloaded. I had read them so many times I practically had them memorized. I flipped to section 11.4, Access to Records. It says right here, I said, pointing to the text. Members are entitled to inspect, examine, and make copies of all association records during reasonable business hours with 10 days written notice. The association may charge a reasonable fee for the cost of copies. So, Tom asked, they're saying $7,500 is their reasonable fee? But it's not a fee for copies, I said. It's a fee for compilation. They're charging you for the labor of gathering the documents. But look at the next subsection. 11.4b, the association shall maintain all records in an organized and accessible manner at the association's principal office. I looked at Tom and Sarah. They've just admitted in writing from their own lawyers that their records are not organized or accessible. They are in violation of their own bylaws. The $7,500 demand isn't a fee, it's an admission of guilt. This was the leverage we needed. Jake, my lawyer, was ecstatic when I told him. "Oh, they are so stupid," he crowed over the phone. "It's like watching a cartoon villain lay their own banana peel. We've got them. We're going to file a motion to compel, and we're going to ask the judge to not only waive the fee, but to sanction the HOA and their law firm for acting in bad faith. This is going to be fun." While Jake prepared the legal torpedo, our grassroots movement was gaining momentum. The Unfiltered website had grown into a true community hub. People weren't just complaining, they were organizing. They started a buddy system for taking out trash cans, ensuring no one would get a fine if they were running late. They organized a carpool for kids to a nearby park, a quiet protest against the no play sets rule. They were small acts of civil disobedience, but they were powerful. They were taking back their community, one small act of kindness at a time. My role shifted from instigator to leader. I used my military planning experience to help them organize. We formed a steering committee with Tom, Sarah, the Hendersons, and a few other vocal residents from the website. We held our meetings at my farmhouse well outside Karen's jurisdiction. My property, once the target of her aggression, had become the resistance headquarters. We were careful. We knew Karen was watching. We heard rumors that she was trying to get the website taken down, filing complaints with the hosting company for harassment. But Tom had chosen the host company well. They were based in Iceland and had a strong free speech policy. Karen's complaints went nowhere. Her power was limited to the physical boundaries of Whispering Pines, and we were now operating on a different plane. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place one evening when a new member joined the Unfiltered forum. Her username was Bookkeeper. Her post was short and cryptic. "I worked for the HOA's management company for 6 months last year. What Karen is doing is worse than you think. I have copies." I immediately sent her a secure, encrypted email. Bookkeeper was, as I suspected, a former employee of the third-party management company the HOA used for their finances. She had quit after witnessing what she called a complete disregard for ethical accounting practices. Karen, she explained, had been systematically misusing the HOA's funds for years. The HOA had 2 credit cards. One was the main operating card, used for landscaping contracts, insurance, and other legitimate expenses. The other was a discretionary card, which was supposed to be for small, emergency purchases. That card was in Karen's name. And Karen, it turned out, had a very broad definition of emergency. Bookkeeper, whose real name was Angela, sent me the statements for that card from the 6 months she had access. When the security system upgrade was a down payment on a top-of-the-line home theater system for Karen's house. The community enhancement projects were landscaping services for Karen's yard. There were charges for expensive dinners, for spa days, board meeting planning sessions, she'd called them, for online shopping sprees, for gasoline for her personal vehicle. She had even used it to pay for the tow truck that had taken my grandfather's Ford. She had been embezzling from the community, hiding her personal expenses under vague and official-sounding budget line items. And the law firm, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, they were on a hefty monthly retainer paid for by the HOA to send threatening letters to residents who fell behind on the very fines that were funding Karen's lavish lifestyle. It was a self-sustaining cycle of abuse and corruption. Angela had made copies before she quit, sensing that it would all blow up one day. She had been too scared to come forward, but the unfiltered website had given her the courage. I now held the smoking gun. Not just one, but a whole arsenal. I had the fraudulent property claim. I had the admission of disorganized records. And now I had proof of embezzlement. Karen wasn't just a bully. She was a criminal. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to attack. The evidence Angela provided was the tipping point, the strategic high ground from which we could launch our final assault. The credit card statements were a damning indictment of Karen's entire regime. It wasn't just a matter of poor judgment or overzealous rule enforcement. It was systematic, calculated theft. When I immediately forwarded the encrypted files to Jake, the silence on the phone after he reviewed them was more potent than any shout. "John," he said finally, his voice cold and hard as steel, "this is no longer a civil matter. This is racketeering. It's wire fraud. It's embezzlement. We're moving from a lawsuit to a criminal complaint. I'm going to have a little chat with a friend of mine in the state attorney's office." While Jake prepared the legal bombshells, our steering committee planned the ground offensive. We couldn't just leak the information. That would be chaotic. We needed to control the narrative, to present the evidence in a way that was irrefutable and devastating. We needed a public forum, a moment of reckoning, and Karen's own rulebook was going to give it to us. I went back to the HOA bylaws, with my dog-eared copy now feeling like a sacred text. Tucked away in the section on governance was a clause allowing homeowners to call a special meeting of the membership with a petition signed by just 25% of the residents. Thanks to our unfiltered website, we had a list of over 100 homeowners who were ready and willing to sign. Sarah, our design expert, drafted a simple, professional-looking petition. Tom set up a series of signing parties at the homes of various members of our steering committee. Within 3 days, we had signatures from over half the residents of Whispering Pines Estates. We had them. According to the bylaws, Karen, as president, was required to schedule the special meeting within 30 days of receiving the petition. We submitted it to the HOA management office via courier, each with a copy sent to their lawyers. The clock was ticking. We used the next 3 weeks to prepare for what we were now calling the reckoning. Tom, the data analyst, took the credit card statements and turned them into a series of devastatingly simple charts and graphs. One showed HOA funds being spent at a luxury spa, juxtaposed with a photo of the fine notice a resident received for a dying rosebush. Another showed the thousands spent on Karen's home theater security system, next to a picture of the 7-year-old's empty backyard where a playset should have been. Sarah took these images and wove them into a powerful PowerPoint presentation. My job was to orchestrate the meeting itself. I knew Karen would try to control it, to use parliamentary procedure to shut us down. I needed a way to bypass her. Now I found it in another obscure bylaw. An independent parliamentarian may be appointed for special meetings upon a majority vote of the members present. The Hendersons, the elderly couple whose house was threatened over the oak tree, had a nephew who had just passed the bar exam. He was young, sharp, and eager for some real-world experience. He agreed to act as our parliamentarian pro bono. We also decided to invite some special guests. I contacted a reporter from the local news who had a reputation for investigative journalism. I gave her a carefully worded, off-the-record briefing, providing just enough information to pique her interest without showing her all our cards. I told her a story about a group of homeowners fighting back against an abusive HOA and promised her a front-row seat to the dramatic conclusion. She was hooked. The final piece of my plan was the most important. It was the ace I had been holding since the very beginning. I drove to the county seat and went to the Hall of Records. I requested to see the original land grant for my property, the 1892 patent document. The clerk brought it out from the archives, a large yellowed piece of parchment, covered in elegant, looping script and sealed with a faded red wax seal. It was a piece of history, a direct link to my great-great-grandfather. I handled it with reverence, but I was looking for something specific, and I found it. A clause written in the dense legal language of the 19th century that granted the owner of the Miller homestead perpetual and unobstructed right-of-way for passage, conveyance, and agricultural purpose across all contiguous parcels. It was established now or in the future. The developer who had built Whispering Pines had clearly missed this, or more likely their title search had been sloppy. The land on which the grand Whispering Pines Estates clubhouse, swimming pool, and main entrance now stood was, according to this 130-year-old document, contiguous to my property. This land grant didn't just prove my property was exempt from the HOA, it gave me a legal easement, a right-of-way straight through the heart of their community. I had a legal right to drive my tractor, my hay baler, my grandfather's 1968 Ford F250, right across their meticulously manicured putting green if I so chose. It was the ultimate trump card. I made a high-resolution, certified copy. The day of the special meeting arrived. The community clubhouse was packed. Every seat was filled. And people were standing along the walls. The energy in the room was electric, a mixture of fear, anger, and hope. The reporter I'd invited was there with a cameraman, set up discreetly in the back. Karen and her two cronies, the Architectural Review Committee, sat at a table at the front of the room, looking smug and confident. She clearly thought this was her chance to publicly crush the rebellion. She banged the gavel. This special meeting, which was so unnecessarily called, will now come to order, she began, her voice dripping with disdain. As per the agenda, the first item is the reading of the complaints from the petitioners. She was planning to let people vent, then dismiss their petty grievances one by one. But that wasn't our plan. Tom Davidson stood up. "Madam President," he said, his voice clear and strong, "I make a motion to amend the agenda." Karen's eyes narrowed. A motion is not in order. According to Robert's Rules of Order, a motion to amend the agenda is always in order. A young man in a sharp suit stood up and said, it was the Hendersons' nephew. "I am a licensed attorney and registered parliamentarian. I move that we vote on my appointment as an independent parliamentarian for this meeting to ensure it is conducted fairly." Before Karen could object, Sarah Davidson seconded the motion. A wave of eyes washed through the room. It was a landslide. Karen was stunned. She had lost control of the meeting in the first 2 minutes. The newly appointed parliamentarian took a seat near the front. "The motion to amend the agenda is now properly before the Assembly," he announced. "Mr. Davidson, your motion?" Tom stood up again, and this time holding a remote for the projector. "I move that we suspend the reading of individual complaints and proceed directly to a presentation of evidence regarding the financial mismanagement of this association." The room erupted. Karen was on her feet screaming, "Point of order! Point of order!" But the parliamentarian calmly noted that the motion was valid. It was seconded and passed with another overwhelming voice vote. Karen sat down, her face pale, as the lights dimmed and the first slide of Tom's presentation lit up the screen. It was the picture of the spa, next to the fine for the rosebush. A collective gasp went through the room. For the next 20 minutes, Tom and Sarah walked the community through the evidence of Karen's theft, slide by devastating slide. The home theater, the lavish dinners, the personal shopping sprees, saw it all paid for with their money. With each slide, the anger in the room grew. People were shouting, demanding answers. Karen just sat there, her face a mask of disbelief, as her kingdom crumbled around her on a PowerPoint presentation. The PowerPoint presentation was just the opening salvo. As the lights came up, the room was in an uproar. Residents were on their feet, shouting questions, pointing fingers at the front table where Karen sat, her face a blotchy, furious red. She looked like a cornered animal, her eyes darting around for an escape route that didn't exist. Her two cronies on the board looked physically ill, as if they were just now realizing the depth of the fraud they had been complicit in. The young parliamentarian skillfully brought the room back to a semblance of order. "The evidence presented is serious," he stated, with his voice cutting through the noise. "Ms. Peterson, do you have a response to these allegations?" Karen finally found her voice. It was shrill, laced with panic. "This is slander. It's a conspiracy. These documents are forged. This man," she pointed a trembling finger at me, where I stood near the back of the room, "is a disgruntled troublemaker who couldn't follow our simple rules. He has poisoned you all against me." "The documents are not forged," a calm voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. It was Angela, the bookkeeper. She had agreed to come, to put a face to her testimony. She held a sworn affidavit in her hand. "I was the account manager. I saw the charges. I saw the cover-up. Everything in that presentation is true, and I have already given a full statement along with all the supporting evidence and to the state attorney's office. If Karen's face was pale before, it was now the color of ash. The mention of the state attorney's office sucked all the air out of the room. This was no longer just an HOA dispute. It had crossed a line into the criminal. The reporter and her cameraman, who had been filming everything, pushed forward, the camera light like a spotlight on Karen's face. This was her moment of public humiliation, broadcast for all to see. But I wasn't done. This was about more than just the money. It was about the abuse of power, the lies, the very foundation of her illegitimate authority. I stepped forward. "She's right about one thing," I said, my voice carrying easily in the silent room. "I am a disgruntled troublemaker. I'm disgruntled when someone tries to steal my property. I'm disgruntled when a bully terrorizes my neighbors. And I'm a troublemaker when I see injustice and decide to do something about it." I walked to the front of the room carrying a large tube. Karen's entire campaign of harassment against me and my family's homestead was based on a single fundamental lie, that my property was somehow part of this HOA. She created documents, filed fraudulent liens, and sent threatening legal letters, all based on this lie. I turned to the stunned lawyer from Dewey, Cheatham and Howe, who had been trying to shrink into the wall. "A lie you were all too happy to perpetuate for a hefty fee." He winced as if he'd been struck. I unrolled the document I had brought and placed it on the table. It was the high-resolution, certified copy of the 1892 land grant. "This," I said, "is not a lie. This is a patent from the United States government, signed and sealed 130 years ago. It is the founding document of my property. It predates this HOA, it predates this county, and it contains some very interesting clauses that your title search company apparently missed." I let that hang in the air for a moment. I could see the lawyer, the HOA lawyer, moving closer, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and dread. He knew what a land patent was. He knew it was the highest form of title. "It contains, for example," I continued, "a clause that establishes my property's boundaries as inviolable. But that's not the fun part. The fun part is this." I pointed to the specific clause I had discovered. "It grants the owner of the Miller homestead, that's me, a perpetual and unobstructed right-of-way across all contiguous parcels." And as it happens, I looked around the room, at the clubhouse, the pool visible through the window. This clubhouse, your main gate, and your lovely swimming pool are all built on a contiguous parcel. The lawyer went pale. He snatched the document, his eyes scanning the 19th century script. I saw the moment he understood. His shoulders slumped. He looked up at me, then at Karen, then back at me. "He's right," the lawyer whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's an express easement. It's ironclad." The room was silent. The residents were confused, not quite understanding the legal implications. But Karen understood, and the lawyer understood. I leaned in close to him, my voice low so only he and Karen could hear. "What this means, counselor, is that my client, that's me, has been very patient. It means that every time your client, the HOA, has denied me access or tried to block my driveway, they have been violating a federally granted right. It means that if I wanted to, I could get a court order tomorrow to have this clubhouse and your main gate torn down because they are obstructing my right-of-way. Or I could simply start driving my hay baler through your annual pool party. Legally." The lawyer swallowed hard. He looked at Karen, whose mouth was opening and closing like a fish, but no sound was coming out. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice still low but sharp as a razor, "every fine you've levied, every lien you've filed against every person in this room has been done under the authority of a board president who has been systematically embezzling funds. That makes every single one of those actions fruit of the poisonous tree. They are all null and void. You have no legal standing." I straightened up and addressed the room again. "What this all means is that Karen's rule is over. It was built on lies and funded by theft. It ends tonight." A motion was made from the floor to remove Karen Peterson and the 2 other board members from their positions, effective immediately. It passed unanimously, with the exception of the 3 people in question. Another motion was made to install an interim board, with Tom Davidson as president, to oversee the association until a new, proper election could be held. It also passed unanimously. The lawyer from Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, in a desperate act of self-preservation, each stood up and publicly announced that his firm was withdrawing as counsel for the HOA, citing irreconcilable ethical conflicts. He practically ran out of the room. The meeting devolved into a celebration. People were hugging, crying, shaking hands. The Davidsons, the Hendersons, the single mom, the young couple, they were all free. The cloud of fear that had hung over the community had been lifted. Amid the celebration, I saw Karen. She was standing alone, abandoned by her cronies, her lawyer, and the people she had terrorized. The reporter was trying to ask her questions, but she just stared blankly, her world shattered. Two uniformed sheriff's deputies entered the clubhouse. They had been waiting outside, called by Jake, who had coordinated with the state attorney. They walked calmly and purposefully to the front of the room. "Her, Karen Peterson?" one of the deputies said, his voice polite but firm. "You need to come with us." As they led her out, her hands cuffed behind her back, she passed by me. She stopped and looked at me, her eyes filled with a venomous, uncomprehending hatred. "You," she spat, "you ruined everything." "No, Karen," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You did. I just held up a mirror." And with that, they were gone. The queen had been deposed, the kingdom was free, and my grandfather's truck was safe. The aftermath of the reckoning was swift and decisive. Karen Peterson's arrest was the lead story on the local news that night, complete with footage of her being led away in handcuffs from the chaotic clubhouse meeting. The reporter I'd tipped off had her story, and she ran with it, and painting a detailed picture of the HOA queen of corruption and the grassroots community movement that had brought her down. The Whispering Pines Unfiltered website, once a clandestine forum for the oppressed, became the official community hub for the newly liberated neighborhood. Tom Davidson, as interim president, proved to be an excellent leader. He was fair, transparent, and dedicated to dismantling the oppressive structure Karen had built. The first act of the new board was to declare a general amnesty. Every outstanding fine levied under Karen's reign was voided. All liens were immediately removed. The law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe was hit with a bar association complaint for their role in the bad faith legal actions, and they eventually settled with the HOA for a significant sum to avoid a larger lawsuit. And the legal and criminal proceedings against Karen moved forward. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Angela's documents, the testimony of dozens of residents, and the HOA's own shattered financial records, she eventually took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony embezzlement and wire fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years in state prison and ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for the full amount she had stolen, a figure that investigators pegged at over $200,000. Her house, with its ill-gotten home theater system, was sold to help cover the debt. The two cronies who had sat on the board with her were not charged criminally, but they were ostracized from the community. They both sold their homes within 6 months and moved away in disgrace. Whispering Pines began to heal, and the oppressive beige uniformity started to give way to individual expression. The first sign of change was the playsets. One by one, they started appearing in backyards, a riot of cheerful color. The new board, in one of its most popular moves, passed a new guideline. Playsets are awesome, go nuts. Garden gnomes, flamingos, and all manner of whimsical lawn ornaments began to appear. The Support Our Troops ribbon magnets were back. The Hendersons' oak tree, now properly cared for by an arborist paid for by the HOA's Tree Restoration Fund, began to show signs of new life. The community pool, once a place of tense silence, was now filled with the sounds of children laughing. My role in the community shifted. I was no longer a revolutionary leader, but an honored neighbor. I was given a lifetime, honorary, non-voting membership to the new reformed HOA, a token of their gratitude. I politely accepted but made it clear that my homestead would forever remain my own sovereign territory. The Davidsons became close friends. Young Leo's new playset, a magnificent wooden castle, was the first one to go up, and I helped Tom assemble it one sunny Saturday. As we sat on their deck, watching Leo and his friends swarm over the structure, Tom raised a beer to me. You know, he said, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad we have an HOA. I must have looked at him like he'd grown a second head. He laughed. A real one, he clarified. One that actually brings the community together, instead of tearing it apart. We're doing a neighborhood barbecue next month, a movie night in the park for the kids. We're a community now, not a prison camp. And that's because of you. I just nodded, taking a sip of my own beer. It wasn't what I had set out to do, but the unintended consequences were, for once, positive. My fight had been for my own property, my own peace, but in winning that fight, I had inadvertently liberated 1,000 other people. There was one last piece of business to attend to. The 1892 land grant and the powerful easement it contained was a sword of Damocles hanging over the community. While I had no intention of ever using it to tear down their clubhouse, its existence was a legal ambiguity that could cause problems for them down the line, especially if they ever wanted to sell or refinance the common areas. Jake, my lawyer, drafted an agreement. It was a formal document that clarified the easement. In it, I agreed not to exercise my right-of-way in any way that would disrupt the existing structures, the clubhouse, the gate, the pool, for as long as they stood. In exchange, the HOA formally and legally recognized, in perpetuity, that my 160-acre homestead was not, and never could be, subject to any of their rules, covenants, or assessments. They also granted me a permanent key-card access through their main gate, a gesture of goodwill and a practical solution for easier access to the main road. We signed the agreement at my oak dining table, the same table where the revolution had been planned. Tom signed for the HOA, and I signed for the Miller homestead. It was a peace treaty, a formal end to the war. The final symbolic confrontation came a few weeks later. I was out in my barn, polishing the chrome on my grandfather's F250. The truck had never looked better. I had taken it to a specialist who had removed the last vestiges of that bumper patina and re-chromed it to a mirror shine. It was perfect. I heard a car pull up my long driveway. It was a plain sedan, and a woman I didn't recognize got out. She was from the county assessor's office. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, a clipboard in her hand. For a second, a flash of the old anger, the old defensiveness, went through me. A woman with a clipboard on my property. It was a potent trigger, but her eyes were kind and her smile was genuine. "I'm just here to update the parcel map," she explained. "We're officially redrawing the line based on the new agreement and a review of the original patent. We're expunging the incorrect survey that started all this mess. And just wanted to let you know it's all been put right in the county records. Permanently." She made a few notes, took a few measurements with a laser tool, and was gone in less than 10 minutes. It was over. Truly, finally, officially over. That evening, I sat on my front porch, a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was cool and smelled of freshly cut hay from my fields. I could hear the faint, happy sounds of the neighborhood over the hill, a dog barking, the distant laughter of children. In the fading light, my grandfather's truck gleamed, a sentinel of chrome and steel, a testament to endurance, to heritage, to a fight well fought and won. The old stone wall that marked my property line seemed to glow, a symbol not of division, but of respect. Good fences, I thought, really do make good neighbors, especially when everyone understands which side of the fence they're on. The war was over, and all that was left was the peace, and it was good.